All right. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 7. Starting in verse 1. Judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. And with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considers not the beam that is in thy own eye? Or how wilt thou say to the brother, let me pull out the mote out of thy eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thy own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast you your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again and rend you. A few years ago, a church in Oklahoma disfellowshipped a woman for immorality. And then she filed a lawsuit against the church, and the story made the news media. And one of the shows to give the lawsuit coverage was a Phil Donahue show. And on that show, I think the attitude of Donahue and most of the audience could be summed up in the words, judge not that you be not judged. Don't you hear that being thrown around? When you try to point out something, they throw that at you. It bothers me to hear someone use Matthew 7, verse 1, that way. But you see, it's nice to have a verse to prove what you already want to believe. And I think that's how this verse has been used. It's been used to convey the idea, you live your lifestyle and I'll live mine. But don't you tell me how to live, and certainly don't you try to impose your standards of morality on me. Judge not that you be not judged is spouted by a lot of people who have no earthly idea what Yeshua meant by that. And I venture to say that the people who quote this verse the most are the ones who understand it the least. It just happens to fall into the line with the spirit of our time. A teenager is at odds with her parents because they laid down the rules that she can't go out with a certain boy because they don't think it would be good for her spiritual development. So she storms out of the room and screams, judge not that you be not judged, and slams goes the door, and she feels that she's cleared her system of her responsibility to tell her parents off biblically. Or some student gets drunk and has to be disciplined on a Christian college campus. Immediately his friends rally around the student, become very biblical, saying, judge not that you be not judged. Well, what was Yeshua saying in Matthew 7? I think one of the key verses in understanding it is Matthew 5:20. Matthew 5, verse 20, for I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. We must have a different kind of righteousness from what the scribes and Pharisees had. They wore theirs on their sleeves. It was superficial. Ours must grow out of the heart committed to our Father. And Matthew 7 is part of that context. Yeshua here in the Sermon on the Mount deals with two different extremes of the problem of human judgment. The first extreme is a harsh, critical spirit. The second extreme is permissiveness. So I want to take a look at both of these extremes. Don't judge. Matthew 7, verses 1 and 2. Judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the same measure you use, it will be measured back to you. As Yeshua looked at the religious situation of his day, he saw that judging others had become a great religious problem. The Pharisees and scribes sat in the place of the critic. They were quick to pass judgments on those who didn't live up to their expectations. When Yeshua was in the house of Simon the Pharisee, and the sinful woman anointed his feet, Simon said in Luke 7, verse 39, "Now when the Pharisees which had bidden him saw it, he spoke within himself. He's saying to himself, this man, if he was a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that touches him, for she's a sinner." The Pharisees, in their self-righteous arrogance, had created a special class of people called sinners, as if they themselves were not. The Pharisees were used to judging others self-righteously. Yeshua said there are problems with that kind of judgment. It's overly critical, always going around with a nitpicking attitude, digging and searching for faults, always suspecting the worst. So Yeshua says that we are not to judge. Now, he's not talking about the judgment in the courtroom. He's not talking about the judging open and obvious sin, and we will get to that later. He's not talking about judging false teachers. What he's talking about is a hasty, unloving, holier-than-thou type of attitude. We sometimes call this jumping to conclusions. It's all the very heart of gossiping and rumor-bearing. Yeshua wasn't saying we should never assess people with some discrimination, but rather that we should not have a harsh, judgmental spirit. A man by the name of John Stott put it this way: Jesus does not tell us to cease from being men by suspending our critical powers which help us distinguish us from animals, but to renounce the presumptuous ambitions to be God by setting ourselves up as judges. That's what drives this overly critical attitude, a belief that I can see as Yahweh sees. I can see your motives. I can see the way you're thinking. I know all the things that have led you to this point in your life. That's what Yeshua wants to eliminate. Whenever we make a judgment, we do so based on what we have seen, and sometimes that's not enough to provide the whole picture. Human judgment is limited to the information which we put into it. Sometimes that isn't enough to make an accurate judgment. The Indians had a saying, "Don't judge a man until you've walked a mile in his moccasin." And there's something to that. For example, a person brought up in a Christian home can't really know the temptations of a teenager brought up in a thoroughly sinful environment. The fact is that if we realize that some people have to go through, instead of condemning them, we might marvel that they have succeeded at being as good as they are. You know, there's a story about a newspaper reporter that would be one example of what we're talking about. A reporter was once searching for a story about the laziness that existed throughout the South, and when he saw a man in his field sitting in a chair and hoeing his weeds, this had to be the ultimate laziness. So he rushed back to his car to start his story. When he looked back a second time, and what he saw changed his entire outlook. He saw that the pant legs on the farmer hung down loose. The man had no legs. So what seemed at first to be a story of laziness turned into a story of great courage. But that goes to show the limits of what we sometimes see in other people. Yahweh once made the point that man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 1 Samuel chapter 16, starting in verse 7. But Yahweh said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, or on the height of their stature, because I have refused him. For Yahweh sees not as man sees. For man looks on the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks on the heart. That's why I don't have the right to sit in judgment on someone else's motives, because I don't know what they are. Only Yahweh knows. It was in response to this sort of critical attitude that Paul responded. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not my own self. For I know nothing by myself, yet am I not hereby justified. But he that judges me is the Lord. Therefore, judge nothing before the time, until the Lord's come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsel of the heart. And then shall every man have praise of Yahweh. We can't know everything in everybody else's heart. I can't read all your motives. I can't see you as Yahweh does. I need to give you the benefit of the doubt. That's what Paul meant when he said in 1 Corinthians 13 that love believes all things. Love believes the best. So we go to 1 Corinthians 13, starting in verse 1. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity. Now charity, if you look it up, that's brotherly love, agape. I am become the sounding brass or tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, brotherly love, I am nothing. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and I have not charity, brotherly love, it profits me nothing. Charity suffers long. Brotherly love suffers long and is kind. Charity envies not. Charity vaunteth not itself. It is not puffed up, does not behave itself unseemly, seeks not her own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil, rejoices not in iniquity, but it rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. But above all, I shouldn't be going around trying to find faults in your life. Notice that self-righteous judgment has a boomerang. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. In other words, look, if you start throwing out this critical spirit on other people, it will come back. We will receive the same kind of treatment that we dish out. If we judge others harshly and jump to the worst conclusions about others, we can be certain that we will be treated in the same way. And I believe by both others and Yahweh. How about searching for specks? Matthew 7, verses 3, 4, and 5. And why do you look for the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck out of your eye, and look, a plank is in your eye? Hypocrite! First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck out of your brother's eye. There's another problem with the Pharisaic righteousness. Not only was it overly critical, but it was also hypocritical. It was two-faced. We like to look at people with bifocals. We use the bottom part to see ourselves, and it has a rosy tint to it. We tend to look past any shortcomings, but the top part we use to look at others, and that's the hypocrisy Yeshua was denouncing. It's like the parable in Luke 18 where a Pharisee goes to the temple to pray, and the Pharisee looks through the top of his part of the bifocals and says, "Oh my, I'm glad I'm not like that scumbag over there." And then he looks through the bottom part and says to Yahweh, "You are just so blessed to have me on your side." That's the kind of judging Yeshua condemned. We're not qualified to sit in judgment on others because it is impossible to be impartial. We are influenced by our own imperfections. Yeshua here uses the graphic example of a plank of wood and a speck of dust. The picture is ridiculous. Now, we've all heard this many times, and it has lost the humorous twist. But the people in Yeshua's audience were probably laughing out loud. It sounds like a scene out of the Three Stooges. Here, one guy with a little piece of sawdust in his eye, and there's somebody else with a 2x4 coming out of his forehead. And he's trying to get the speck out of the other guy's eye. And every time he turns around, the other guy has to duck. Perhaps Yeshua used the illustration of a plank and a speck because he was a carpenter, and that was familiar to him, and it was familiar to the people around him. But if he were living today, he might have said that a man sitting in judgment on another person is like a man watching a football game. Have you ever watched or listened to a man watching a football game, especially if his team is losing? He'll criticize the quarterback for not throwing well, the receivers for not catching the easy passes, the linemen for not blocking well. Have you ever thought, if he's so good at knowing what to do, then why is he sitting in a chair watching the game instead of being out there playing? I'll tell you why. I've seen him try to get out in the backyard and play ball. Yeshua says, you got no room to criticize others because your own ineptitude. But you see, even though we are unqualified, we will judge. And we often do so for selfish reasons. It makes us feel better. If we have a problem with sin in our own lives, it takes a little pressure off to point the finger at others for a while. It makes our sin seem not so bad after all. But Yeshua warns us that we've got to clean up our own act before we tamper with the lives of others. And I don't think that the plank in our eye is necessarily a worse sin. I think he's talking about the sin of self-righteousness, appointing ourselves as the official inspector of the brotherhood. When I spend my time pointing my finger at your sin, my attention is distracted from my own sins. And that's the real danger of judging. We are all sinners, and we are trying to work together as a family to overcome our sins. But ultimately, the only sin over which I have control are my own. And those are the ones that should command my greatest attention. An illustration of this is found back in Genesis 38. Judah's daughter-in-law, Tamar, had lost her husband. Judah gave her his son, one of his sons, but he wouldn't cooperate in giving her a child, and then he died, and Judah wouldn't give her his youngest son as the law demanded. So Tamar did the only thing that she could think of. When Judah announced he was going to the market, Tamar, dressed as a prostitute, disguised herself and seduced him. Became pregnant in the process. Later, when Judah learned that Tamar was pregnant out of wedlock, he said, "Oh, this is terrible. Tamar must be killed." So she walked out and said, in essence, "That's fine, but I want you to know that you're the father." We can see so well the things in others' lives that we want to pick on. But Yeshua said we're usually being overly critical and hypocritical when we do it. But it's important for us to notice that he didn't stop there. He didn't instruct us to stay out of other people's business. Rather, he gave us the responsibility of helping our brother. First, remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck out of your brother's eye. Chapter 7, verse 5. What's the loving believer to do when someone comes to you and he's got a speck in his eye? Turn and walk away? No. Do you say, oh no, I could never take that speck out of your eye? I've had specks in my eyes before. Of course not. He's got something in his eye and he needs it taken out. Or suppose a child comes to you with a splinter in his finger. He's crying, please take the splinter out. What's the believer to do? Leave the splinter there? No, you take the splinter out. So Yeshua was saying there is a place for some discernment in people's lives. If you see a brother or sister who has specks in their eyes, you need to help them take it out. But first, you take out the 2x4 of self-righteousness out of your own eye. Paul puts it this way in Galatians 6, verse 1. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. You who are spiritual, not self-righteous, but spiritual. Those of you who have the evidence of the fruit of the Spirit in your life, you go restore him. Matthew 7 shouldn't interfere with that responsibility. We have to go to somebody in loving confrontation. Oh, the right way to judge. Matthew 7, verse 6. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces. The harsh, critical spirit is obviously wrong, and some have tried to get so far away from that they've gone to the opposite extreme, which is permissiveness. The holder of this position point to the first 5 verses of this chapter as their proof text. We are not the judge. They stress long and loud that we cannot judge. They interpret that as meaning we cannot judge in any case or in any setting. And especially don't try to tell me I'm doing anything wrong. An interesting situation arises though. When somebody takes this position, they believe that you can't judge anyone else as being right or wrong, and you have no right to condemn the way anyone is living. If you are doing that, you are wrong, and that you shouldn't live that way. So they practice the very thing they claim is wrong for others. The permissive person holds to a religion that serves the great mush god. Everything is all right with Yahweh. The motto of the permissiveness is live and let live. He will never condemn a practice as sin or a doctrine as false, because to do so is judging. And he believes in being tolerant. But Yeshua doesn't end his discussion of judging with the command, judge not. He goes on to say, do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you think verses 1 through 5 prohibit any kind of discerning in judgment, you've got a real problem here. Because you've got to use some kind of criteria to decide who those spiritual dogs and pigs are. First, Yeshua says, don't judge, don't condemn. Then in the same breath, he says, make certain judgments concerning people and behavior. So how can these two positions be reconciled? These two positions actually complement and limit each other perfectly. In the first statement, as we've already seen, Yeshua condemns the critical, holier than thou, jumping to conclusions sort of judgment that the Pharisees were known for. In the second statement, Yeshua acknowledges the need for making decisions concerning people and behavior that is detrimental to our Christian lives. Verse 6 stands as a safeguard against an extreme interpretations of verse 1 through 5. It's not the case that Yeshua condemns all judging. In fact, he demands that we make some judgment. In John 7, verse 24, Yeshua said, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgments." In John 4, verse 1, John tells us, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of Yahweh, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." In 1 Corinthians 5:11, Paul tells us, "But now I have written unto you not to keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. With such a one, no, not even eat." That demands that we make a judgment on some sort. The command not to judge others doesn't mean that we can't see the sinfulness of certain actions. Now, we're never to look down in self-righteous judgment on another sinner, for we've all fallen short of the glory of Yahweh. But we can recognize sin as sin. And we should never try to justify it. You don't give to the dogs the sacred sacrifices reserved for the priest, and you don't feed your pearls to the pigs. You can take a pig and put him in a bathtub. You can wash him, floss his teeth, you can put lipstick on it. You can do whatever you want. Then you put him back outside, and you know where he will go? Right back to the mud. Yeshua was saying there are people like that. These words are harsh, but his point is that we shouldn't waste spiritual treasures on those who have no spiritual interest. Story about Mike. Mike used to live on the coast, and every once in a while he'd go fishing and catch some grouper, which sold for what those groupers selling for now?
About $6 a pound.
Well, there you go. So anyways, on one occasion he serves one of the groupers to some friends who came over, and they tasted it and said, "Ooh, this is really good. It tastes like chicken." To him, that was the ultimate insult. A simple bird that sells for maybe, $1 a pound? And he was telling, his friends were telling Mike that what his hard-won grouper tasted like. He had shared pearls with swine. The next time they came over, Mike served them chicken. In Matthew 10, Yeshua sent some disciples out, and he said, "Look, when you go into a town and they don't have the time of day for you, shake the dust off your sandals and get out of there." Some people are spiritual pigs and dogs. Paul received some rough treatment in Corinth, and on his second missionary journey, and Luke reports in Acts, chapter 18, verse 6, "And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go unto the Gentiles." We've got to use that kind of discernment and not waste spiritual treasures on people who will just trample on them. Now, this is the exception rather than the rule. We don't jump on this idea and stop evangelizing. We still have to tell our story, tell about Yahweh and Yeshua. But there are some people who have no spiritual interest. They will trample the precious things we hold dear to our heart. You tell them the truth about what the Bible says and they trample on it. That's just an old book. It's just fairy tales. Don't tell me how to live. Don't give me your morals. They will trample on the precious things that we hold dear to our heart. Yeshua said to use some discernment, have the ability to make judgment in our minds. So what is the message of Matthew 7, verse 1 through 6? I think it's a warning for us to avoid the extremes of judgment. We need to be careful not to become harshly judgmental, looking for faults, taking the opportunity to look down on others from our position of self-righteousness. But neither are we to overlook sin. We need to be able to recognize sin for what it is. Any attempt to overlook or justify sin on any grounds is itself sinful. We've seen the teachings of Yeshua. Let's notice his example, John 8. Yeshua is confronted by a mob pushing before it a woman that was caught in the act of adultery. The mob tried to use her as if she was a thing in order to trap Yeshua. The Jewish law said she must die. The Roman law said that she couldn't be killed without their permission. There was never any doubt about her guilt, nor was there any doubt as to the seriousness of her actions. So what did Yeshua do when confronted by this? First, he refused to look down on her. He wouldn't allow the mob to treat her as a thing. Rather, he forced the mob to consider their own sin. But, second, he didn't justify her behavior. He wouldn't refer to her action as anything other than sin. He forgave her and challenged her to stop sinning. Yeshua will do the same for us. If you come to him, he will also forgive our sins, and he will challenge us to live a life of purity for him. Yahweh bless.